This will be a newly scripted book review because I'm a rambling idiot and I don't want to try and figure out all the swaths of tangents that I get on whenever I make a review. So, here we go. This is my book review of Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This book review is going to basically be more of a book talk with highlights that I found interesting. I feel like if I'm going to review this book, this is how I want to do it, because everybody else who has read this book gives the general cut and dry cookie cutter stuff. So this is going to be more a highlight, things that I want to talk about in this review, because I feel like I'm going to be repeating myself, beating a dead horse, if you will, by saying that this is a really good book. It's well put together, it's well thought out, and I haven't read all the annotations, but it was fun reading some of the ones that I did for the purposes of this book. A quote from one of the annotations: "This novel focuses primarily on Ciri, Vivanna, and Lightsong. Vasher, as the fourth viewpoint, is only there fairly sparsely." Brandon Sanderson. So as a warning, there's going to be spoilers. If you don't want to watch this video and haven't read the book and don't want to be spoiled, because apparently putting it in the title of the YouTube video doesn't make people happy, I don't know, turn off this video, go read the book, come back, and we can talk about it. Anyway, the first thing I want to make clear is that I haven't read the entire annotation chapters in the back of the book. I might do that later, definitely, but as there are quite a bit of them, I was finished with the book at 82%. There's about 15-17% left of the book that's annotations. So I decided to hold off on it for the moment. With that being said, based on what I've read so far, I do get the impression, as an aspiring author, that I will want to read them eventually. There seems to be quite a bit of useful information in there in regards to plotting and editing and just writing a novel. Not necessarily in that order, but there you go. Reading the first pages of Warbreaker made me really excited. I got to get a good look at Sword-nimi from Oathbringer, and now I know where Sword-nimi originated from in the first place. So it was really exciting for me to see Sword-nimi in this Cosmere universe that Brandon Sanderson concocted for everybody in the world. Reading this novel offers a huge highlight into the sword that is... Reading this novel offers a huge highlight into what the sword is, how it came here into the physical Cosmere universe, and what it's supposed to do, because we don't really get that much of an understanding of what it's supposed to do in Oathbringer. So, read Warbreaker if you want to know what Sword-nimi does. Now, speaking of which, now I want to read Oathbringer again just so I can study Sword-nimi chapters. Now, I've come across an interesting thing Brandon Sanderson inserted into his book that has prompted me to wanting to film a later video on it. Arranged marriages seem to be an overarching romantic theme in his books. Many of his characters seem to find love in these arranged marriages, as is the case for Ciri and the God King. A parallel to that in the Stormlight Archive, because that's all I've read of his world so far, is Adolin and Shallan, how they fell in love with each other after being in kind of like a unofficial engagement, if you will. So they did have the time to date. Ciri didn't. Ciri and the God King didn't, but they still managed to fall in love anyway. having only read Warbreaker, Warbreaker and the Stormlight Archive by him, I can't say with definite certainty that arranged marriages are kind of an interest to him, something that he actually wants to portray in a positive light, because honestly, it's cliche not to. It actually is. It's cliche for the potential bride to be very, very, very much against the arranged marriage, or the potential groom to be very, very, very much against the arranged marriage. So it's an interesting thing. Very few authors actually do it, and I was very excited to actually see that and come away from it feeling the warm fuzzies instead of the cold pricklies, if you will. Anyway, the magic system also captured my interest. With that being said, it does have a feeling of I drank a bit too much while writing this book one evening and it just kind of stuck. Despite this, there seems to be a certain level of sophistication he lends to what is easily seen as a silly system of magic, that it makes up for it. So once you kind of get past the weirdness of awakening things with breath, and the amount of breaths you have will enable you to awaken more things and see more colors. And honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, he also could have been playing like a video game, maybe Legend of Zelda or something, I don't know. But like he could have been playing a video game and came up with this from that video game. I don't know. He hasn't, from what I read of the annotations, he didn't quite expand on it to my liking, but I mean, whatever. The idea of awakening is certainly interesting, along with his system of needing those breaths to awaken objects and or people, dead people. The breath causes the magic, and the breath fuels the heightened sense of reality that the hosts have when they collect even more breaths. And now that I'm thinking about it more, it really is starting to sound like a video game. But, every author has their inspiration. Ciri and Viviana are two characters that act as stark contrasts to each other, which goes into the color theme of the book. There's a theme of colors. It's an atmospheric theme, if you will, and it's everywhere, where colors are compared, colors are seen, colors are known, and colors contrast with each other. They mold, they form, they work very well together, or they contrast against each other like a really, really bad neon green and pink. So he also does a good job of creating certain lessons that each character needs to learn. Ciri needed to learn how to pay attention to her surroundings despite becoming bored with certain subjects, as well as needing to learn to respect those in authority over her. Viviana, the more scholarly and pious and obedient sister, needed to be sufficiently humbled from the arrogance she taught herself in those years leading up to the beginning of the novel. I also liked the princess and the pauper motif with them, where Ciri is more uneducated in the ways of court, and Viviana is very educated in the ways of court, very educated in the Idrian version of what Haladrin actually is. Those are the places of the novel, basically. Despite the fact that both were princesses. So that was interesting. Because Ciri always snuck away from her tutors, so she rarely learned the things that she needed to learn about ruling, and honestly, because she was like the last child, nobody particularly cared. The God King's physical state. I thought it was interesting what Brandon Sanderson did there. It becomes apparent in the novel that the country isn't, in fact, ruled by a theocracy, but a priestocracy, if you will. I made that word up. The gods don't really have a say in anything other than a few important matters that their priests contribute heavily to. Now, there is a reason as to why the gods don't actually rule. Their lives are quite short, and based solely on when they become so emotionally moved by their followers that they end up releasing their final hold on life just to heal somebody. The purpose of the God King is not to rule, apparently, but to hold a vast amount of breaths that the priests of his religious sect considered divine, because they came from the first God King. So that was interesting. The sign of a king's reign ending, interestingly enough, is when a character returns from the dead and becomes a god, and it's usually a baby. When a newborn or stillborn becomes returned, and just so you know, when stillborns are returned, they still age. For those of you who read the book and don't quite remember that bit, or for those of you who want to read a book and are trying to figure out what does this mean by returned, returned are dead people who have such a strong hold on life, at least that's what we're seeming to see, or die bravely, die heroically, all that kind of stuff, that they come back as living beings with kind of a godlike state. Their bodies are transformed. Everything. It's an interesting transformative thing that it's an idea that comes from Christian and Mormon mythology. By the way, I found out recently that Brandon Sanderson is a Mormon, which sums up a lot of what I see in Warbreaker. I think a lot of his, as an aside, I think a lot of his religious commentary, his religious symbolism comes from Mormonism, and I think it's very evident in this book, especially now that I know he's Mormon, and now I'm like, oh, it makes sense. So there's that interesting little tidbit. But anyway, so back to the original point. Babies, when they are born stillborn and yet come back as returned, they grow up and then stop growing, which is interesting. It's a plot hole that he never really explained very well because he probably didn't know how to address it. And it's, you know, it's one of those things where it's just kind of like you read a book and you're just like, that's a plot hole. That's a world building flaw. But everything else is pretty much fine. So I'm not gonna comment too much on it. I mean, you know, whatever, right? Because at that point, you're just kind of like, when you're reading the book, you're just kind of like, okay, that makes sense, I guess. I don't know. This magic system is weird, which is fine. I enjoyed the book just because it was weird, you know. I like weird books. Anyway, another quote from the annotations of Warbreaker. And finally, we arrive at my personal favorite character in the book, Lightsong the Bold, the god who doesn't believe in his own religion. A quote from Lightsong: "Did you just try to prove the existence of God to me with your breasts?" I think that's my boyfriend's favorite quote too, because he's reading this book and he texted it to me while I was at work today, and I'm just like, oh, you got to that point. Yeah. So again, it's one of those moments where I tell you, like, I'm not kidding when I tell you, this book, sometimes there are parts of it where I'm just like, he was drunk. But he's Mormon, so he probably didn't drink. I don't know. It was interesting. Like, there's points in time where he'll come out with lines and scenes in this book where I'm just like, okay. Anyway. Now, Sanderson talks about where this character comes from in his annotation for the chapter, but I also want to add a critique on the character as well. Lightsong the Bold. This comes back to a suspicion that I had with Wit. I don't know if I ever voiced my suspicion about Wit in my Oathbringer review, but I'm going to go on ahead and voice it here. Every author has a tendency to insert themselves into their novels. As a writer, myself, I most certainly am not immune to this, and Sanderson isn't either. When I read Lightsong, I see heavy similarities between what I suspect Brandon Sanderson is, Lightsong is written, and then, of course, Wit from the Stormlight Archive. There's a sense of meta-critique of the overall story in his scenes, as well as moments when Lightsong comments on something in a way that makes it seem like an outside source of consciousness, i.e. Sanderson's actual opinion about the situational moment he's writing about. As someone who is currently constructing her own set of characters, I find this fascinating. I liked how he took Lightsong's character and made his own entity. He grows on us as a philosopher and a man who rather detests the fact that people decided to worship him. And one of the things that I've always believed about Brandon Sanderson is that he's a philosopher, a philosophical writer. His books are philosophical epics. They're philosophical pieces. They exist to make you think about things. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy reading his books. I think they're fun. They have almost a Dune-esque feel about them. So, but a little less crazy. Even Warbreaker is not as crazy as Children of Dune was. I'm going to do a review on that at some point too, because that was interesting. But Warbreaker is still tamer than some of the stuff I've read. Anyway, his chapters quickly become some of my favorite chapters to read in the 4 Sanderson books I've read so far. Wit and Kaladin chapters in the Stormlight Archive are included in this. So, as you can see, there's a reason why, like, especially where Wit is concerned, I like a lot of Wit's chapters, as few as they are in the Stormlight Archive. Lightsong, you see more Lightsong, and you still get almost the same feeling that from Lightsong that Wit gives off. And that's kind of how I've come to this conclusion that maybe, just maybe, Brandon Sanderson has inserted himself a little bit into Lightsong. And if that's the case, it's actually pretty cool, because even though I suspect Lifesong is a self-insert, he's still his own character. He's still not exactly like Brandon Sanderson. And you know what? As far as a secondary character goes, and Lightsong is still a secondary character, this book isn't entirely about him. In fact, he more than often drives the plot along. He's more of a plot tool than his own character, but he's still his own character anyway, and it's fun to read him while he drives the plot along. So there is that, and I get the fun feeling of, okay, that was awesome, that was fun, or better yet, just a good few moments where I just had to like bite my lip to make sure I didn't burst out laughing at work while I was reading this book. So yeah, this was fun. I enjoyed Lightsong, and apparently he's Brandon Sanderson's baby anyway, so it makes sense. Anyway, so all in all, I give this book a 4 out of 5 star rating, and anticipate the next books Sanderson has come out with that I will read, and then the many more to come. And that's all for now. I am sure I did not cover everything and the wealth that's in Warbreaker, but this book review is already almost 20 minutes long, so I don't want to spend all my time talking about this, because this thing would be like 2 hours long if I did. Anyway, comment below, tell me your thoughts, and have a nice day, y'all.